From Software and Hidetaka Miyazaki must have known they had something special on their hands with 2009's Demon's Souls, but what they couldn't have known was how that game and its spiritual successor would reshape the way players in the gaming industry thought about action RPGs and combat-forward experiences. Fast forward more than 15 years later, and the Souls-like is perhaps the fastest-growing subgenre of action RPGs. The term Souls-like essentially applies to any game that can trace its lineage back to Demon's Souls, as well as its follow-up and From Software's breakout success, Dark Souls. And while early attempts at making a Souls-like were little more than a shameless imitation, we're now reaching the point where many non-From Software games are beginning to hit the same level of quality as the original greats that inspired them. Before we dive into our ranking of the best Souls-like games, let's establish a few ground rules. First, this list is covering games not made by From Software, as that studio's titles can't be Souls-like and are instead under the category of Soulsborne. Yes, even Sekiro and Elden Ring. Second, to be a Souls-like, a title needs to have at least a few of the following elements in its gameplay. Death should be a frequent and necessary component. Enemies drop currency for leveling up that is lost upon death, and players must commit to corpse runs to retrieve lost currency, which is gone forever if they die again before retrieval. Combat emphasizes precision and a methodical approach, and is typically governed by a stamina meter. Maps are labyrinthine and loop in on themselves, with players able to open up shortcuts linking back to earlier sections. Checkpoints restore the player at the cost of resetting the world around them, including regenerating enemies, and limited stat point allocation and stat-dependent gear encourage specific character builds that cater to different playstyles. The following games are 15 of the best titles that embody these prescribed genre elements, while also delivering new and unique mechanics of their own. So with that out of the way, here are our 15 favorite Souls-like games. Colloquially referred to as anime Dark Souls, Code Vein is a commendable attempt at a darker Souls-like that mostly sticks the landing. The game's sharp anime-inspired visuals and animation are backed up by an almost completely nonsensical plot about the post-apocalypse and vampires, but gameplay is where Code Vein shines. Rather than restrict players to a specific build, which at the time of Code Vein's initial release, most Souls-likes had opted to do, Code Vein gives players blood codes that act as the game's archetypal classes, each of which can be swapped at will. Together with the right Blood Veil, which is a unique combination of armor and weapon that grants buffs and resistances, and the right scaling weapons, Code Vein's blood codes offer a lot of freedom and flexibility in how players choose to build out their characters, and it's a better game for it. While it does err a little bit on the easier side once players come to grips with its combat and mechanics, Code Vein is a solid Souls-like that's great fun while it lasts. Few would have expected Respawn Entertainment to follow up the excellent Titanfall 2 and Apex Legends with a licensed Star Wars game that borrows heavily from the Sekiro playbook, but they did, and we are grateful for it. Pretty much what that description would have you believe, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is a game built entirely around its excellent lightsaber combat, which leans heavily on a parry mechanic that plays a bit like Sekiro Light, thanks to its more forgiving parry window and supremely devastating follow-up attack. Fallen Order is also an excellent Star Wars game that tells a compelling story set between the events of episodes 3 and 4, showing us some incredible levels and set pieces that make great use of the Star Wars license and turn hero Cal Kestis into that universe's version of Uncharted's Nathan Drake. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is also great, but there's a case for Fallen Order being the better Souls-like. Probably as close as we'll ever get to a Finding Nemo Souls-like, Another Crab's Treasure is a misleadingly cute game with a bright and cartoonish art style hiding some truly excellent combat and a Dark Souls-worthy challenge. It's not surprising that this game ended up on many players' best of lists for 2024 for both its rock-solid Souls-like gameplay and its emotionally affecting tale, which manages to hit right in the feels regarding the state of our planet without coming off as preachy or pretentious. Another Crab's Treasure is a Souls-like with a very pertinent message, but it also happens to inject plenty of humor into proceedings and not take itself too seriously, even if some of its boss fights and platforming challenges are as serious as a heart attack. And should you find the game too difficult, Aggro Crab has gone the extra mile to include a ridiculous one-hit kill rage-winning item thanks to the Give Krill a Gun setting. You could jokingly refer to Stellar Blade as K-pop Dark Souls, but that would be doing this excellent 2024 Souls-like a disservice. While the mechanics and gameplay of Stellar Blade clearly borrow liberally from both Dark Souls as well as more straightforward character action games like the modern Ninja Gaiden titles, the game's narrative, atmosphere, and setting are clearly influenced by Yoko Taro's Nier Automata. And even though it doesn't come close to hitting the same highs of Nier, Stellar Blade is nonetheless an incredibly interesting Souls-like that opts for a more direct approach to its storytelling than most other games in the genre. Combat is similarly impressive, with plenty of viable options for defense and evasion beyond the standard block and parry that turn tougher encounters into an eyebrow-raising spectacle. I might personally like the first Surge more thanks to its horror-leaning atmosphere and chunkier, slower-paced feel, but there's no denying that the Surge 2 is an improvement over its predecessor by nearly every possible metric. As much as I love a classic Unga Bunga run with a heavy weapon and a good Souls-like, the Surge 2 made me rethink that strategy thanks in large part to how fast and fluid combat feels when using lighter weapons. The targeting system, where players can specifically aim for different parts of an enemy's body and harvest gear schematics and their necessary crafting or upgrade materials from them, is a stroke of genius, and it's a system I would love to see return in another Souls-like. The game's interesting and novel incorporation of Metroidvania elements into its impressively large, semi-open world map is yet another unique wrinkle that makes the Surge 2 all too easy to recommend for anyone who hasn't played it. Taking the genre expertise of Team Ninja and combining it with the story and characters of the original Final Fantasy is a wild idea that shouldn't work on paper, but it absolutely does in practice. The secret to Stranger of Paradise is Square Enix's handing of the reins over to Team Ninja for the title's gameplay and progression mechanics, turning this Final Fantasy Souls-like into a sort of Nioh 3 that marries many of that series' best ideas with the universe and iconic classes and weaponry of Final Fantasy. The best part about Stranger of Paradise is how all-in the game goes on its gear collecting and build craft, especially in the endgame where it feels like the real game truly begins. First impressions of Stranger of Paradise might have been a little off-putting thanks to all the chaos memes, but underneath its goofy exterior lies a rock-solid action RPG with some best-in-class progression and a surprisingly excellent retelling of the first Final Fantasy story. There have been plenty of 2D Soulsvania games that blend the elements of From Software's Dark Souls with the mechanics and progression of a Metroidvania, but few do it as well as Clover Byte's GRIME. The poster child for 2D Dark Souls has long been Salt and Sanctuary, but I'm a firm believer that GRIME is both a better Souls-like and a better Metroidvania, mostly thanks to its extremely off-putting art direction and its oppressive atmosphere, both practically begging the player to keep searching for answers despite the fact that we might be afraid of the truth that they uncover. Outside its impressive narrative and vibes, though, GRIME has some excellent combat and boss encounters, including a very satisfying parry mechanic that allows your character to absorb the abilities of fallen enemies and turn them into stat-boosting or combat-enhancing traits. GRIME is wonderfully weird and obtuse, and the wait for the recently announced GRIME 2 already seems too long. Another of the 2D Soulsvania games, and one that should be high up on most players' to-do lists if they haven't experienced it yet, is Blasphemous. Like GRIME, Blasphemous will immediately draw you in thanks to its stunning visuals, which in this case include 2D pixel art and animations, and a haunting and surreal representation of Andalusian Spain, with enough religious symbolism to make Xenogears fans blush. Underneath its impeccable style is a rock-solid combination of methodical, heavy-hitting combat, and some unique platforming and traversal challenges that shake up the traditional jump, double jump, wall climb loop that many Metroidvania titles adhere to. The Game Kitchen would deliver an excellent sequel in Blasphemous 2, but the original Blasphemous is arguably more Souls-like, where its sequel goes all in on its Metroidvania elements. Team Ninja might lay claim to being the best Souls-like developer outside of From Software, and the game that is perhaps its greatest showpiece for its skill at combat systems and encounter design is Wo Long Fallen Dynasty. Wo Long can essentially be thought of as a combination between Nioh and Sekiro, and it pulls the best parts from each of its influences to become a game built entirely around its excellent melee fighting and incentivization of careful progression and buildcraft. Similarly, Wo Long features a story, setting, and atmosphere that blend historical fiction and folklore like Sekiro, only it swaps out that game's feudal Japan setting for one taking place in Han Dynasty China. Wo Long is brutal, fast-paced, and structured in such a way as to emphasize repeating levels and grinding for better gear, and it also happens to be one of Team Ninja's greatest games. The original Lords of the Fallen from 2014 holds a significant place in history as the first Souls-like to try and replicate Dark Souls' formula, but while it included some good ideas, Deck 13's Lords of the Fallen was mostly a reminder that you weren't playing a better game. Thankfully, the property didn't die with that 2014 entry and ended up getting a reboot in 2023 with CI Games' excellent and confusingly named Lords of the Fallen. While 2023's Lords of the Fallen doesn't do much to shake off its Dark Souls comparisons, even going so far as to lean harder into them, it features some excellent combat and buildcraft, a unique world-traversing mechanic that calls to mind Legacy of Kain's Soul Reaver, and some very strong level design that makes each new area a treat to explore. There's a case to be made that Sekiro is a departure for From Software that some don't consider to be one of the studio's Soulsborne games, but it also happens to be no less influential than Dark Souls, with many of the best Souls-likes now towing the line between that subgenre and the new Sekiro-like moniker. Perhaps the best Sekiro-like of them all is Red Candle Games' Nine Souls, which features some near-perfect parry and deflection-heavy combat that is arguably the closest any non-From Software studio has come to replicating Sekiro's greatness. Adding to its phenomenal combat and rich offensive toolkit is Nine Souls' heartfelt and tragic narrative, which will hit players right where it hurts when the ending scenes play out, following the game's true final boss and most substantial challenge. Both one of the best Souls-like games and one of the greatest Metroidvanias, Hollow Knight has now gone on to be almost as copied as Dark Souls itself, inspiring a legion of indie developers to try their hand at the 2D, hand-drawn Soulsvania. But while it would be easy to write off Hollow Knight's impact on indie game development as being symptomatic of its incredible breakthrough success, the truth is that it's simply a phenomenal game that exudes atmosphere in practically every element of its design. The story and characters of Hollow Knight are evocative and compelling, with barely ever speaking a word, and Team Cherry's ability to convey so much information through the environments of Hallownest is a prime example of the show, don't tell method of storytelling. Throw in some best-in-class melee combat and platforming, along with a substantial challenge, and you have a Soulsvania that deserves the pedestal it's been placed upon. Just because Souls-likes are typically very challenging doesn't mean they can't be outright fun, which is a sentiment that Gunfire Games seems to have taken to heart. The first Remnant from the Ashes was an amazing co-op third-person shooter Souls-like hybrid that blended supremely satisfying shooting and melee combat with an impressive degree of build variety and enemy diversity. Remnant 2 ups the ante further by doing everything the first game did, but better, including providing greater class variety with its many unlockable archetypes, compelling use of procedurally generated levels to keep each new run feeling fresh, and a constant stream of worthwhile loot and exciting quest design that immerses players into its dark multiverse story right up until the thrilling final showdown against the Root Nexus. Just talking about it has me wanting to go back and invest another couple hundred hours. It's a tough call to place Nioh 2 without including the original Nioh on the list, but this sequel does everything that Nioh does while improving on it to such an incredible degree that it deserves top billing in its place. Were it not for NeoWiz's Lies of P, Nioh 2 would lay claim to being the greatest non-From Software Souls-like game, and for some, it still will take the cake as the most rewarding and challenging title to not come from the Dark Souls creators. Like its predecessor, Nioh 2 blends 3 incredible timeless games perfectly into one incredibly addictive and rewarding mix: Dark Souls, Ninja Gaiden, and Diablo. The title's combat deftly straddles the line between methodical Souls-like and frantic character action, and the deep gear and loot system creates seemingly endless possibilities for how players build out their hero as they take on increasingly challenging and stunningly designed yokai. A masterpiece in every sense of the word, and a strong contender for Team Ninja's best game. When it comes to non-From Software Souls-likes that come close to scratching the same itch as the games that inspired the subgenre, perhaps no game does it better than Lies of P. While most of us await the day when Sony and From Software will do something with the Bloodborne IP besides letting it languish on the PS4, NeoWiz took it upon itself to do the best job possible at crafting a sort of spiritual successor, using Carlo Collodi's The Adventures of Pinocchio as its source material. The end result? A shockingly good Bloodborne-like with a masterfully created Victorian Gothic setting, excellent combat that favors parrying and aggression, and a surprisingly deep and rewarding narrative that utilizes more direct storytelling devices than the traditional Souls-like is known for. That we're getting a DLC this year is all the more reason to play this masterpiece if you have yet to step foot in the dark, rain-slick streets of Krat. Those are our picks for the 15 greatest Souls-likes, but we've really only just begun to scratch the surface. We're more interested in your choices, so let us know your favorite Souls-like games in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the notification bell for more content from Cheat Code Central.